Are you sabotaging your strength by deloading? If you deload every 4 weeks, you could be holding your progress back. You're tired, sore, fatigued, and you know a deload is coming up. But do you really need it? How often do you feel weaker, more tired, or feel like you're losing momentum? You're sore from a lift and you feel you need a break, but is a deload slowing you down? You could be fatigued, but is that a real sign you should deload? Are you deloading too early? And how do you know if you're doing enough? And if the fatigue you're feeling is real or coming from somewhere else? We will explore how deloading is stalling your progress. And we'll dive deeper into why is it even 4 weeks? I'm Gus Cook. I coach elite powerlifting. I've been coaching powerlifting for the last 15 years, and over that time, we've gotten over 250 podium finishes, 26 all-time records, coaching some of the strongest athletes in the world, including Sarah Rainbow, who is the strongest female in all of history. I'm here to simplify the science and show you proven, tested methods that work in the field. If you like this type of content, subscribe, comment, and like. That will really help me. In a basic nutshell, we introduce a training stimulus, which then our strength decreases temporarily. This introduces fatigue, which stimulates a recovery response. Now, our strength is reduced by a thing called preparedness. We're not going to go too deep into that, but that represents the ratio between the recovery and your strength, which then represents the strength you can express. We can probably represent that with a purple line. Right, so that means your strength expression is decreasing. Now, after a bit of rest, right, we get an increase in strength above baseline. This happens because fatigue comes back down and that recovery response has come up. And your expression of strength increases. Now, how compensation works is that as that fatigue accumulates, as you can see here, we also get an increase. In strength, but over time we start to get a decrease in strength. Now, this is mostly due to fatigue and preparedness. When that fatigue gets high, we get even though strength is increasing in this direction, let's use a blue, that strength is increasing in this direction, your ability to express strength actually starts to reduce because fatigue is really high. So what we have to do is deload. So if we have a shorter volume period, then strength won't actually increase. Deloading doesn't increase strength. It will actually plateau out. And if you deload for too long, it'll actually get weaker. But what does happen is that we get a compensation, right? Preparedness increases because we get a reduction in fatigue. Now, we have to be careful with this because this can lead to detraining syndrome, which you are starting to see here. Now, another problem is deloading too much. So if we look at this chart here, if we are barely adding enough stimulus to make progress, we get a strength curve that doesn't really increase too much. We deload, we don't have a very strong adaptation response. That starts to decrease, and our strength actually will start to decline. Our compensation will just be balanced. So we could be just making progress, But if you're deloading too early, we stall. So deloading is the purposeful planning of neurological restoration from planned overreaching. So I want to lead into part one of this, which is it's not about being sore. Having sore joints, inflammation in the elbows, shoulders, that's a mechanical problem. That has nothing to do with the nervous system. You might say, but I'm getting so sore from squats, my knees are hurting. Well, that's mechanical. We haven't introduced, or if you haven't introduced enough neurological stimulus where we require a recovery to create this compensation, then we still end up stalling, more because your technique is a limiting factor and the deload is stalling your progress. So I want to lead into part one of this, which is it's not about being sore. Having sore joints, inflammation in the elbows, shoulders, that's a mechanical problem. That has nothing to do with the nervous system. You might say, but I'm getting so sore from squats, my knees are hurting. Well, that's mechanical. We haven't introduced, or if you haven't introduced enough neurological stimulus where we require a recovery to create this compensation, then we still end up stalling, more because your technique is a limiting factor and the deload is stalling your progress. We want to feel a little bit of fatigue. This fatigue is what creates that adaptation response. But fatigue can be misinterpreted. Many things can feel like we don't want to train, we're tired. We can easily convince ourselves that. This comes down to how your day was, or this could be a real sign from training. But is fatigue so bad? And how do we know if fatigue that we're producing is we need to respond with a deload, or that we need to accept this and keep going? Because the last thing you want to do is pull back too early and start to stall your progress. The strongest indication that you need to recover is that your strength is decreasing. Now, this makes sense because I have seen it many times with clients is they're fatigued. They feel fatigued. Everything feels hard. They're going like, everything just is feeling harder. I'm losing motivation. But when we closely look, their strength is still increasing. There are still dips, but there's no real decrease. If anything, these people are the strongest they've ever been. But the downfall sometimes with this type of person is that their subjective view of fatigue, which is not correlating with their actual strength progress, becomes the limiting factor. They start to convince themselves that it is getting too hard. So they won't push hard enough. Now, that's another topic on the psychology behind training. So, as a coach, I would utilize some sort of KPI. And just like anything in like business, when you're using KPIs, you're using leading, concurrent, and lagging indicators. Leading indicators are things that I can recognize that will cause fatigue. That could be dieting, increase in physical activity, external stresses. They're going to play in a role, and we'll be able to predict if there's going to be a reduction in strength. And it pays to know this because we need to be able to separate the subjective from the objective. Concurrent. Concurrent is the most important metric. Is strength increasing or decreasing? That is the major key here. We can feel fatigued, overwhelmed, and stressed. But if there's no real indication that strength is decreasing based off comparing to previous performances, baseline performances, or estimated performances, then we have nothing to worry about. It just feels fatigued. But that is the metric you need to follow the most. And we don't want to be reactive. Some days we are just weaker. But does that mean we have to deload? Not necessarily. If we know we're going to introduce fatigue, we know that we're going to have a decrease in performance. And if we know that, we can then continue through and work out when we will deload, if that's in the plan, or we push through. This is where it pays to know, or pays to plan and predict when we might deload based off these numbers. Now, lagging indicators are things that are too late. We've been fatigued for too long. The main things that happen here is huge mood disturbances, sleep disturbances, and a huge reduction in training motivation. You've just lost heaps of motivation, just don't feel like training. Illness, getting sick more often, and injuries. If there's something to be an increase in pain and injuries, it can be from just accumulating too much fatigue. So we need to have some sort of measures in place to tell us whether fatigue is enough, not enough, or too much. Detraining is your baseline strength decreasing, not from having too much training stimulus or too much fatigue, but not enough. And if we deload too often and too drastically, we just don't have that momentum. And you've probably felt it before. You got good momentum and you take a deload, and all of a sudden you're just a lot weaker. This happens a lot around competition, where people test really close to competition and then take a week off and just feel lethargic. They've lost momentum. They wish they just kept training because they were just feeling stronger in training. And this is the downfall of a deload. It doesn't always pay to take a break. Now, if you want more information on how peaking and tapering works, which is a lot different than this video, then make sure you check out my video and on peaking, and you can learn more about that. Deloading can be overkill because deloading is a recovery strategy. And taking a week off or reducing your training load by 50% can be a very drastic measure. And there could be simpler measures that you could take. So first of all, we can just look at some passive interventions. Improving your sleep. Are we getting 7+ hours? Should be the bare minimum. Top performing athletes, 8 hours, 9 hours, even 10 hours if you're deep, hard in prep. Sleep more instead of trying to cut out training. Are you eating an adequate amount of food, hydrating, and is the food of high quality? Do you have enough protein and plenty of carbohydrates? It can be easier to work in a slight surplus. Easiest way is think about a slow increase in weight gain. Maybe 0.5% or 1% per month. We definitely don't want to be any faster than that. If we gain weight too fast, it's mostly going to be fairly useless weight. We can incorporate light training days. where there's just one day that is half the volume of the rest. I might do this a lot with my guys if we're training 4 days a week, where 3 days throughout the week are fairly intense and heavy, and the Saturday might be lighter, right? It allows us to fill the gaps in the past that we're missing, gets a little bit more volume in bench, but it doesn't overreach you too much. You could plan these every second week, or in the final fourth week, instead of taking the full week down, you could just taper the last 2 days down. And then one I use a lot is undulating training. Now, undulating periodization is a method where you would rotate volume and intensity and have a reduction in things that generally introduce a high amount of fatigue. Anything over 90% of your max for an intermediate to an advanced lifter introduces a drastic amount of fatigue, which will inhibit performance. So doing this week to week, or even high volume week to week, will just accumulate into a lot of fatigue. What we can do is that instead of every single lift progressing at the same time, we can have some lifts maintaining, some lifts accumulating volume, and some lifts accumulating intensity, and even rotate that between the lifts so that we can progress some areas in bench press while we push the deadlifts, then push bench, which gives us a bit of a break whilst we maintain the other two lifts, then drive up squats. And that's a very common strategy I utilize to help manage recovery without having to take drastic measures. Then the last part of this is, do we want to take a proactive measure or a reactive measure? So proactive is, we plan this. Reactive is we push hard and then react to it. Now, people think reacting to it might be bad. But for beginners, I think reactive-based deloads can be quite effective as long as it's determined by the coach, because it takes a bit of time for a beginner to understand what true fatigue is compared to subjective fatigue. And this allows us to see that we can just keep pushing. You might find, and I get this a lot with beginners, is that I increase training intensity and volume constantly. They keep progressing. Nothing change. They don't get any weaker. If anything, they just keep getting stronger. And especially for someone who's beginner, early, intermediate, deloading too much is a sure sign that you're not going to make progress. They're just not strong enough to need a deload or to introduce enough fatigue. So here are my 4 practical recommendations that are tried and true for every single person, because there are many recovery and deload strategies, but there are a few things that will always work, and those very advanced techniques, honestly, only work for a few percentile. So number 1 is tracking performance within a range. And we want to track it within about a, say, 5%, even up to a 10% range. We can just look at the actual load and reps compared to history, or we can use an estimated 1RM adjusted for RPE. And what this does is that this will tell us whether if what we're doing, the training we're doing, is impacting strength over time. It may decrease and it may increase, but we use a range because that range would be a normal amount of accumulation of fatigue. And if it goes beyond that range, then that's when we might require an intervention, or if there's been a reduction steadily over a 2, maybe 3 week period. Tracking estimated 1RM within a range is a great indicator whether or not that there is too much training or something else happening outside, which leads me to recommendation number 2, which is there any external stresses influencing fatigue? Now, what we would see is their subjective perception on it that might not influence strength or may influence strength. This is where we have to take away the subjective and look at the objective. How well does the bar move? People will tell me this feels like a 9, 10 RPE. I watch the video, it's a 6 RPE. It's fine. It's in their head. More often than not, something external is happening. And that's what we would look at. We would look at what can they do to reduce stress, or how do they want that to reflect in their training? Or how can I get them to see what is happening? So external stresses matter. Number 3 is, do you have a recovery strategy? Because you can be leaving so much on the table, because if you're not sleeping enough or eating well, that adaptation that you need to increase your strength just won't occur as much, because you're inhibiting that adaptation response. And we're holding on to a lot of fatigue, which then our ability to express strength is drastically reduced. So looking at your sleep, looking at your food intake, looking at stress, and even relaxation and socializing are very important aspects to an athlete's health and recovery. And final recommendation is, which kind of ties into some of the other things we talked about, are you just too soft? Right, it's something I'll not tell my clients directly, but I will create a direction based off how hard they train or what I can see, coming back to these objective measures, and can always tell if they're not training hard enough, right? And that might be you. You could just be more responsive to external stresses, to things that cause anxiety, that influence your training. And we need to be reflective on that. So don't think you are just soft. I'm just kind of saying that as a joke, but really it requires some reflection on, am I training hard enough? Are external factors causing me to not train hard enough and making me misinterpret this as fatigue? So do we need to deload every 4 weeks? Probably not. It may work for some because it just so happens to work, but nothing really indicates that 4 weeks is the necessary approach. So why does 4 weeks always exist? Well, simply it's easy to sell. Memberships are normally every 4 weeks or every month, and they're easy to track and write for coaches, but doesn't necessarily mean that's the right thing for the athlete. It might be convenient, but it can stall progress. We're better off continuing our training and looking recovery elsewhere, within and external, before implementing some sort of deload. We want to make sure we separate the subjective feeling of fatigue and the objective changes in performance. But if whatever you're doing right now is working, stick to it. If I've done well today, this should open more questions than it has answered. And that means I think I've done a good job. If you found this helpful, go over to my Instagram, give me a follow. If you have any questions, want some coaching or any sort of feedback, shoot me a DM. I'll be happy to help you out.